All right, sit down and buckle up for this next story, because if you don't know about American imperialism, I'm about to pop your history cherry here. So, oftentimes we hear the silly argument made that America is truly and purely altruistic and benevolent in our foreign policy, and we only care about protecting democracy and freedom around the world. Well, if that's the case, it's strange that we have the, quote, top 7 fascist regimes enthusiastically supported by the U.S. in an article out today on Raw Story. So let's run down the list here, and I'll give you all the historical context and information that you need to understand what happened. Number 1 is Chile. You heard a lot of talk about this in recent days because of the protest against Henry Kissinger, calling him a war crime, of course, actively supporting the regime in Chile, the dictatorship in Chile. So that, of course, was General Augusto Pinochet's military junta, ruled from 1973 to 1990. They say, quote, in 1970, socialist Salvador Allende was democratically elected president in Chile. Allende had been in office for 3 years when far-right forces in the Chilean military staged an armed insurrection with the help and encouragement of the CIA and the Nixon administration. A U.S.-backed military dictatorship under General Augusto Pinochet came to power, and thousands of Allende supporters were killed and tortured. Not until 1990, after 17 years of fascist rule, was democracy restored to Chile. You want to know who Pinochet's hero was? Mussolini. This is the guy we actively supported and backed financially. Now, isn't it hilarious that in America we scream about how we need to protect democracy around the world? This is the exact opposite. We overthrew a democratically elected government because we didn't agree that it was left-wing, and we put in a fascist leader. Number 2 on the list is Guatemala's military dictatorships. Quote, for decades, the U.S. supported harsh military dictatorships in Guatemala, and its reasons for doing so can be summed up in 3 words. United Fruit Company. This is where the term Banana Republic comes from, by the way, and you'll understand as I go through here. The UFC, a huge American corporation, not to, of course, be mistaken with today's fighting UFC, made considerable profits from fruit plantations in various Latin American countries, including Guatemala, and when Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz, who won by a landslide in Guatemala's 1951 election, pushed a program of agrarian reform, the UFC lost some of the uncultivated land it had in that country. Arbenz, popular among indigenous Mayans, was popular among them, but very unpopular with the UFC, which lobbied the U.S. government to remove him from power. The UFC got its way in a coup orchestrated by the U.S. State Department and the CIA. Arbenz' democratically elected government was overthrown in 1954 and replaced by the repressive military dictatorship of Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. And the U.S.-backed military regimes that followed Armas's assassination in 1957 proved to be even worse. Tens of thousands of Guatemalans were slaughtered by fascist military forces and far-right death squads in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So there you have it again, the exact opposite of supporting democracy around the world. We were overthrowing democracies around the world and putting in fascist leaders. Now, why? Why were we doing this? Because it was the Cold War, and we were so afraid that the Soviet Union and communism would take over the world and it would overthrow our country, and in our fear and paranoia, we decided we'll support any leaders, fascist leaders, military dictatorships over any kind of left-wing government that we fear might even smell 1% like communism. That's why they did it. And they were 100% wrong to do so. I never bought the argument that if communism happens in Vietnam, next thing you know, it's going to be in West Virginia. Nonsense. It was totally made up. It's fear, it's paranoia, it's craziness is what it is. Number 3 on the list is Nicaragua. The Somoza dynasty was supported by the U.S. from the 1930s to 1979. This one started even before the predominant period of U.S. imperialism post-World War II. They say, quote, they took power militarily in 1934 and remained until 1979 when they were overthrown by the Sandinista National Liberation Front. The Samoas operated a U.S.-backed military dictatorship. The Sandinistas were detested by the Reagan administration and the CIA, who aggressively supported the Contras, a right-wing terror group, in their efforts to overthrow the new government. Reagan often denounced Sandinista President Daniel Ortega as heavy-handed and dictatorial, which was truly ironic in light of the cozy relationship the U.S. had with the Somozas for many years, who tortured people regularly. Again, supporting fascism goes right in the face of the narrative that you're taught in the United States of America about how we are always the good guys and everybody else is always the bad guys. Look at the history of what we did. These are the facts, and this is quite damning. Number 4, El Salvador's military dictatorship. From 1979 to 1992, we supported, quote, El Salvador has a very painful history, and one of the most painful parts is the civil war that lasted from 1979 to 1992. During those 13 years, a U.S.-supported military junta wasn't shy about using death squads and torture in its efforts against the leftist guerrillas, FMLN. Number 5 is Argentina. The Dirty War is what it was called from 1976 to 1983. Quote, the military junta that ruled Argentina from 76 to 83 was infamous for its human rights abuses. An estimated 30,000 people were killed, and one U.S. politician who was on friendly terms with the junta, according to declassified U.S. State Department documents, was Henry Kissinger. Back to the conversation about him being a war criminal. Bolivia's number 6, the Hugo Banzer dictatorship. From 1971 to 1977, quote, when the policies of Bolivia's socialist president Juan José Torres angered the Nixon administration in the early 1970s, the U.S. helped to overthrow him and install the fascist military dictatorship of General Hugo Banzer. The Banzer regime lasted until 1977, and during Banzer's rule, torture and false imprisonment were common. And finally, number 7, Paraguay. The Alfredo Stroessner regime. 1954 to 1989, they say, quote, General Alfredo Stroessner, who was in power from 1954 to 1989, was a strident anti-communist, and that was enough for the U.S., which pumped millions of dollars into his regime in the 1950s and 1960s, and had a close relationship with the Paraguayan military for many years. Torture, kidnappings, and other human rights abuses were common under the Stroessner regime. You know, they go on in this article to describe how the U.S. also supported a collective goal, funny word to use because they're so anti-communist, a collective fascist goal of death squads that literally went around and they went marauding through all of South America, and they would take people who were former presidents or who were leftist leaders and just assassinate them in cold blood. There's one story of the death squad literally chopping people up with a fucking chainsaw. So whenever people tell you, oh, you don't get it, man. The United States, they care about democracy, they care about freedom, they're the world policemen, rightfully. Understand that that's such a simplistic, childish, toddler-like, anti-historical view of the world.